we will be introducing a 100% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles.
Canada just made a bold move that could shake the global auto industry, and Beijing is furious. In a shocking escalation of their already strained relationship, Canada has slapped a massive 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. This new policy shift, which many are calling a declaration of economic war, could send shockwaves through global trade. For years, China has dominated the electric vehicle market, flooding countries around the world with affordable, impressive EVs. Canada, like many others, became increasingly dependent on these imports as it pushed for greener alternatives to gas-powered cars. But that dependency just became a weapon. With one swift decision, Canada has not only challenged China's economic stronghold, but also put itself in Beijing's crosshairs. The stakes couldn't be higher. Will China strike back with even harsher retaliatory measures? Can Canada withstand the economic blowback if Beijing targets crucial exports like agricultural products or natural resources? And most importantly, was this just the beginning of a much bigger economic conflict that could pull other nations into their issues? We're about to break down why Canada made this drastic move, how China is likely to respond, and what this means for the future of global trade. Stay tuned. The announcement of Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles caught automakers and global markets completely off guard. It's a bold move that signals not just economic retaliation, but a strategic shift in Canada's trade policy. So, why did this happen? To understand the magnitude of this decision, we need to look at the bigger picture. For years, China has held an iron grip on the global EV market. Its manufacturers, like BYD and NIO, produce electric cars at impressive speed, often at prices that competitors in North America and Europe simply can't match. That dominance didn't happen by accident. China has been heavily subsidizing its EV industry, pumping billions into automakers to ensure they stay ahead of the game. And it worked. Chinese EVs are cheaper, more accessible, and increasingly popular on the global stage. But that success came at a cost, one that Western countries are no longer willing to pay. Both the United States and the European Union have accused China of unfair trade practices, claiming that these government subsidies create an uneven playing field. The US fired the first shot back in May by announcing its own tariff on Chinese EVs, followed closely by the EU imposing duties of up to 36.3%. Now, Canada has joined the fight, making it clear that it won't sit on the sidelines while China's electric car power steamrolls the competition. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau didn't mince words when justifying the decision. According to him, Canada is positioning itself as a global leader in the automotive sector of the future. And countries like China can't be allowed to cheat their way to the top. We are transforming Canada's automotive sector to be a global leader in building the vehicles of tomorrow, Trudeau said, emphasizing that China's practices are unfair and unacceptable. But this decision wasn't made on a whim. The move follows growing geopolitical tensions between Canada and China over various issues, ranging from human rights violations to cybersecurity concerns. In recent years, relations between the two countries have soured significantly, marked by disputes over trade and technology. Canada's recent decision to ban Chinese telecom giant Huawei from its 5G network was a major turning point. China, unsurprisingly, did not take the news lightly. The Chinese Commerce Ministry swiftly condemned the move, calling it blatant trade protectionism and accusing Canada of violating World Trade Organization rules. A spokesperson warned that the tariffs would seriously undermine the global economic system, urging Ottawa to immediately correct its erroneous practices. The message was clear. China sees this as more than just a trade dispute. It's an attack on its economic ambitions. The impact on the automotive industry is already being felt. Chinese EV manufacturers like BYD and NIO, who have been gradually making progress into the Canadian market, now face a barrier. Even Tesla, which manufactures some of its vehicles in Shanghai, is caught in the crossfire. Canada is Tesla's sixth largest market, and the company is likely scrambling to mitigate the damage. Experts predict Tesla will either intensify lobbying efforts to seek exemptions or shift its Canadian imports to factories in the United States or Europe to bypass the tariffs. And it's not just automakers feeling the heat. Canadian consumers are suddenly looking at significantly higher prices for EVs, especially those imported from China. While Chinese brands are still relatively rare on Canadian roads, the few that have entered the market are now in a difficult position. Meanwhile, European car makers are capitalizing on the situation. Canada has already struck billion-dollar deals with major European manufacturers, aiming to position itself as a key player in the global EV supply chain. The global response has been equally tense. Allies like the United States and the European Union are backing Canada's decision, seeing it as a necessary step to counter China's market manipulation. But the real question is how far Beijing is willing to go in response.
An escalating trade war with China could spell trouble for canola farmers here. Beijing implementing retaliatory tariffs on select Canadian farm imports in response to Canadian duties against Chinese electric vehicles.
China wasn't going to just sit back and take it. Less than 6 months after Canada announced its 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, Beijing hit back hard. On March 20th, China announced tariffs of its own, targeting some of Canada's most vital exports. Canola oil, canola meal, peas, pork, and seafood would now face tariffs as high as 100%. These products represent some of Canada's biggest export sectors to China, and the message was extremely clear: play stupid games, win stupid prizes. China framed the move as a necessary countermeasure, accusing Canada of breaching World Trade Organization rules and warning that Ottawa's actions undermine the global economic system. The Chinese State Council Tariff Commission made it clear that this wasn't just about EVs and steel. It was about setting a precedent. China's leaders were determined to show that economic coercion would be met with equal force, no matter the cost. Prime Minister Trudeau's administration didn't back down, maintaining that the tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles were essential to protect Canada's growing EV industry from being overwhelmed by heavily subsidized imports. However, the fallout from China's retaliation was swift and severe. Canadian farmers and food producers found themselves caught in the crossfire, suddenly locked out of one of their largest export markets. The timing of China's move wasn't just reactive, it was strategic. For months, China had been scrutinizing its trade policies toward Canada and Mexico, having in mind that both countries might cave to US pressure and hike tariffs on Chinese goods. With the United States consistently pushing its allies to crack down on Chinese imports, Beijing wanted to send a clear warning to both Ottawa and Mexico City. Don't become America's pawn in this trade war. Yet the real impact of China's tariffs went beyond the agricultural sector. They also sent a message to the global community, particularly countries in Asia and Europe, that Canada's decision wasn't without consequence. For nations like Japan, South Korea, and India watching from the sidelines, the escalating trade war forced some difficult questions. The United States and the European Union, predictably, stood by Canada's side, emphasizing that the tariffs on Chinese EVs were a necessary step to restore fair competition. Washington even framed China's retaliation as evidence that Beijing was doubling down on its unfair trade practices. Meanwhile, Mexico, cautious not to get caught in the crossfire, adopted a more reserved stance, mindful of its own trade relationships with both the US and China. But the economic consequences for both sides were undeniable. Canada, as China's second-largest trading partner after the United States, suddenly found itself dealing with plummeting agricultural exports. The canola industry alone was facing billion-dollar losses as large quantities of oil and seed sat idle, unable to reach the Chinese market. Pork producers scrambled to find alternative buyers, but global demand couldn't make up the shortfall. On the other side of the Pacific, Chinese EV manufacturers like BYD and NIO faced dwindling prospects in North America. Their expansion plans, carefully laid out to capture the growing Canadian market, were in tatters. Even Tesla, caught up in the tariffs due to its Shanghai-made models, found itself forced to consider shifting production to other factories just to keep its foothold in Canada. But it wasn't just businesses taking a hit. Consumers in both countries felt the sting, as higher prices on electric vehicles and agricultural products became unavoidable. Supply chains that had been optimized for cross-Pacific trade suddenly faced enormous disruptions, with both nations scrambling to reconfigure logistics and find new trading partners. In the global automotive market, the ripple effects were already becoming obvious. With Chinese EVs essentially priced out of Canada, European automakers sensed an opportunity. Brands like Volkswagen and BMW, which had been slower to compete on price, now found themselves with a sudden competitive advantage. Canada's push to align more closely with European manufacturers, backed by multi-billion-dollar deals, looked increasingly strategic, positioning the country as a reliable partner for Western automakers rather than a dumping ground for cheap Chinese imports. The unfolding trade war wasn't just about cars and canola, it was about influence and power. China wanted to make it clear that countries aligning with the West would face economic consequences. But by targeting essential Canadian exports, Beijing risked galvanizing even more international opposition. Allies like the United States and the European Union doubled down on their own tariffs, determined not to let China's aggressive response break their resolve. As the dust settled from this latest escalation, one thing became clear. This was no longer just a bilateral trade disagreement. It was a full-scale economic confrontation, with global alliances being tested and new partnerships emerging from the chaos. Whether Canada would buckle under pressure or stand firm remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: this trade war was far from over. From an economic standpoint, one can argue that Canada's endgame seems to revolve around reducing dependence on Chinese imports and bolstering its own EV industry. The North American auto market has long been dominated by major U.S. manufacturers, but with China flooding global markets with heavily subsidized electric vehicles, Canada faced a dilemma: compete or be consumed. By imposing tariffs, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's administration signaled a clear intention to shield the domestic market from undercutting prices while giving North American automakers room to thrive. Part of this strategy aligns closely with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which incentivizes regional collaboration and economic integration among North American partners. With the Biden administration pushing for more domestic manufacturing and tighter control over supply chains, Canada's tariff move also serves as a nod to its closest ally. By making Chinese EVs prohibitively expensive, Canada indirectly encourages automakers to ramp up production within the continent, fostering job creation and technological innovation at home. But that might not be all. There's no denying that Canada is also acutely aware of the national security risks posed by China's dominance in the EV sector. Modern electric vehicles aren't just modes of transportation, they're data hubs on wheels. Smart vehicles collect large amounts of information, from location data to driving patterns. And there's growing concern that Chinese-made EVs could be exploited for surveillance or data harvesting. In an era where cybersecurity and data privacy have become increasingly important, allowing foreign-controlled technologies to proliferate unchecked could expose Canada to significant risks. Also, supply chain vulnerabilities are at the forefront of strategic thinking. China's dominance in the production of EV batteries and critical minerals like lithium and cobalt makes Canada, and much of the world, dangerously dependent on a single source. As global tensions with Beijing escalate, the prospect of supply disruptions or politically motivated embargoes becomes more plausible. Canada's decision to impose tariffs can thus be seen as a proactive effort to diversify supply chains and reduce exposure to Chinese leverage. There's also a political dimension at play. Domestically, Trudeau's administration has faced mounting pressure to take a harder line on China. Public sentiment has shifted. Canada's bold step resonates with a growing global sentiment that democratic nations must push back against authoritarian influence, especially when economic advantages are built on unfair subsidies and state control. The Trudeau administration is also keenly aware of how this decision will play out on the world stage. Standing firm against China positions Canada alongside the United States and European Union, reinforcing the idea of a unified Western front determined to protect its economic interests. While the consequences are significant, Trudeau likely calculated that the political capital gained from taking a hard stance outweighed the immediate economic fallout. Ultimately, Canada's endgame is about far more than just tariffs or cars. It's about asserting control over its own economic destiny while reinforcing national security and demonstrating political resolve. As China responds with retaliatory measures and the trade war deepens, Canada's gamble could either cement its place as a resilient, independent player or expose it to economic blowback that proves too costly to bear. Whether this strategic move pays off remains uncertain, but one thing is clear. Canada is no longer content to be a passive participant in the global economic order. As the dust begins to settle on Canada's monumental decision, the broader implications for Canada-China relations come into focus. The immediate fallout has already been severe, with retaliatory tariffs from Beijing targeting key Canadian exports. But the question now is whether this escalation marks a permanent rift or just a temporary dispute in an already strained relationship. We can't 100% predict what the path forward will be like. Historically, trade disputes of this magnitude often take years to resolve, with each side looking for leverage. The US-China trade war under the Trump administration offers a sobering precedent. Initial tariffs led to a protracted standoff, marked by retaliatory measures, diplomatic stalemates, and, eventually, limited concessions that did little to resolve the underlying issues. Canada could find itself in a similar position, where neither side is willing to back down, and the economic consequences continue to ripple through industries far beyond automotive manufacturing. However, some experts believe that diplomacy could still play a role in de-escalating tensions. Both countries have significant economic ties that neither can afford to sever entirely. China remains Canada's second-largest trading partner, and cutting off that relationship entirely would hurt Canadian agriculture and manufacturing sectors just as much as it would disrupt China's ambitions to dominate the global EV market. Quiet negotiations behind closed doors could eventually lead to a compromise, perhaps involving reduced tariffs or limited exemptions for specific manufacturers. But for now, both sides seem focused, unwilling to appear weak on the global stage. This confrontation also signals a broader shift in how Western nations approach trade relations with China. As Canada joins the US and the EU in imposing stiff penalties on Chinese EV imports, other countries are watching closely. If the move proves effective in protecting domestic industries without sparking catastrophic economic fallout, it could embolden additional governments to follow suit. Nations like Australia, Japan, and even some in Southeast Asia might reassess their own economic dependencies on China, potentially leading to a more fragmented global trade environment, where strategic alliances outweigh free market principles. The long-term consequences could be profound. With China's reputation as the world's factory already under scrutiny, especially in critical industries like electric vehicles and clean energy technology, Western countries may accelerate efforts to localize supply chains and reduce reliance on Chinese production. That shift would inevitably reshape global trade policies, as governments impose stricter regulations and tariffs to protect their own burgeoning industries from being outpaced by heavily subsidized Chinese counterparts. As the geopolitical chessboard realigns, Canada's decision will likely be remembered as a pivotal moment, a bold, risky maneuver that could either solidify its position as a defender of fair trade practices or plunge it into an economic standoff that proves difficult to escape. One thing we can say for certain is that the world is watching, and the outcome of this confrontation will resonate far beyond North America, shaping how nations balance economic pragmatism with the growing imperative to push back against China's global influence.